The C-SPAN cameras captured the tense atmosphere of the Senate Budget Committee hearing. What had begun as a routine discussion about corporate tax reform had suddenly veered into unexpected territory when Senator Bernie Sanders, visibly frustrated by the direction of questioning, made a statement that sent shockwaves through the chamber. "Representative Crockett," Sanders said, his voice rising with the characteristic passion that had defined his decades in Congress. "What these corporations are doing is criminal, and anyone defending their tax avoidance schemes is complicit in that criminality." The implication hung in the air. Several senators exchanged uncomfortable glances as the camera panned to Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, who had been making a nuanced point about balancing corporate accountability with economic growth incentives. For 3 long seconds, Crockett remained perfectly still, her expression unreadable. The committee room fell silent, everyone waiting for what would surely be an explosive response to such a charged accusation from the veteran senator. Then, with remarkable composure, Crockett leaned toward her microphone. "Senator Sanders," she began, her voice measured and respectful, "I've long admired your passion for economic justice. That's why I know you understand the difference between confronting a broken system and attacking those working to reform it from within. Perhaps instead of labeling each other, we could combine your moral clarity with pragmatic solutions that might actually help the Americans we both serve." Sanders' expression shifted from righteous indignation to something more contemplative as Crockett continued with a response that would transform not just the hearing, but the entire national conversation about political discourse in America. If you appreciate thoughtful analysis of pivotal moments in American politics, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Now let's examine how this remarkable exchange unfolded and why it represents something increasingly rare in our political landscape. Before this defining confrontation, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett had established herself as one of the most nuanced voices in the House Financial Services Committee. At 45, the former attorney had built her congressional reputation not on inflammatory rhetoric, but on meticulous policy analysis and a willingness to engage with complex economic realities. "Effective governance requires more than moral certainty," Crockett had explained during a Brookings Institution lecture the previous month. "It demands the patience to understand systems before attempting to transform them." This philosophy had sometimes put her at odds with both the progressive and conservative wings of Congress. While she shared many progressive goals, her approach to achieving them often involved incremental reforms and coalition building rather than revolutionary rhetoric, a pragmatism that occasionally frustrated ideological purists. Senator Bernie Sanders, at 83, represented a different approach to economic justice. Over his long career, the Vermont Independent had become known for his uncompromising stance on corporate power and wealth inequality. His thundering denunciations of millionaires and billionaires had energized millions of Americans, particularly younger voters drawn to his moral clarity and unwavering principles. "The system is rigged," was Sanders's frequent refrain, a perspective that left little room for nuance or incremental change. For Sanders, the economic status quo wasn't merely flawed, it was fundamentally corrupt and required complete transformation. The backdrop for their confrontation was Senate Bill 2741, the Corporate Tax Transparency and Accountability Act. The legislation aimed to close several loopholes that allowed multinational corporations to shift profits overseas, while also creating incentives for domestic manufacturing investment. Crockett had played a key role in crafting the bill's provisions on reinvestment incentives, provisions that Sanders had criticized as corporate giveaways, despite their targeted nature. Her testimony before the Senate Budget Committee had been requested specifically to address these disputed sections. What neither legislator knew was that their exchange would occur against a backdrop of particularly heightened national tensions about economic policy. Just 2 days earlier, a major American manufacturer had announced the offshoring of 3,000 jobs while simultaneously revealing a $12 million compensation package for its CEO. This announcement had fueled public outrage, with Sanders leading the charge in condemning corporate greed. In numerous television appearances, he had called for radical reforms to the economic system, dismissing incremental approaches as insufficient. Crockett, meanwhile, had responded to the same news with a detailed policy proposal that would tie tax incentives directly to domestic employment levels, a nuanced approach that acknowledged both the need for accountability and the complexities of global competition. As the hearing began that morning, observers noted an unusual level of tension in the room. Sanders, known for his passionate questioning, appeared particularly agitated, repeatedly shuffling his papers and conferring with staff. Crockett, by contrast, maintained her characteristic composure, reviewing her notes methodically as other witnesses testified. The stage was set for a collision between two fundamentally different approaches to economic justice, one rooted in moral absolutes and revolutionary change, the other in pragmatic reform and systemic understanding. What no one anticipated was how this collision would transform into a masterclass in political communication and bridge building. Have you ever witnessed someone respond to criticism with such grace that it actually changed the entire conversation? Share your thoughts in the comments about how thoughtful responses can transform confrontation into meaningful dialogue. The Senate Budget Committee hearing had been underway for nearly 2 hours when Chairman Sheldon Whitehouse recognized Congresswoman Crockett for her testimony. The chamber was unusually full for a committee hearing, with staffers lining the walls and several journalists attentive in the press section. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," Crockett began. "I appreciate the opportunity to discuss the reinvestment provisions in S-2741, particularly as they relate to domestic job creation and manufacturing capacity." Over the next 10 minutes, Crockett presented a methodical analysis of the bill's approach to corporate taxation. Rather than offering broad generalizations, she cited specific economic data showing how targeted incentives could be structured to prevent abuse while encouraging domestic investment. The key distinction in these provisions, she explained, is that they tie tax benefits directly to verifiable metrics: jobs created, wages paid, and capital invested in American communities. Unlike previous approaches, these benefits phase out automatically if companies fail to deliver on their commitments. As Crockett concluded her opening statement, Chairman Whitehouse opened the floor to questions, beginning with the committee's ranking member, Senator Lindsey Graham. Graham's questions focused primarily on technical aspects of implementation, which Crockett addressed with specific regulatory frameworks. The exchange was substantive but unremarkable, typical committee work that rarely makes headlines. The tenor changed dramatically when Senator Sanders was recognized for his questioning period. The Vermont senator leaned forward, his brow furrowed beneath his familiar white hair. "Representative Crockett," he began, "you've spoken eloquently about these so-called targeted incentives. But isn't this just another example of Washington coddling the same corporations that have been exploiting American workers for decades?" Crockett responded evenly. "Senator, I share your concern about corporate accountability. That's precisely why these provisions include unprecedented enforcement mechanisms. Unlike previous tax incentives that companies could claim regardless of behavior, these benefits disappear immediately if jobs are offshored or wages are cut." Sanders seemed unmoved. "We've heard these promises before. These corporations take the tax breaks, wait until public attention moves on, then ship jobs overseas anyway. Why should we believe this time is different?" "Because the legislation doesn't rely on corporate promises," Crockett replied. "It creates an automatic clawback mechanism triggered by quarterly employment data. Companies that reduce their American workforce lose these benefits retroactively and face significant penalties." The exchange continued in this vein for several minutes, with Sanders pressing on what he viewed as fundamental flaws in the approach, and Crockett responding with specific policy mechanisms designed to address precisely those concerns. The turning point came when Sanders, visibly frustrated by what he perceived as defense of corporate interests, escalated his rhetoric significantly. "Representative Crockett," he said, his voice rising with the characteristic passion that had defined his decades in Congress, "what these corporations are doing is criminal, and anyone defending their tax avoidance schemes is complicit in that criminality." The implication was unmistakable. Several senators shifted uncomfortably in their seats as the camera panned to Crockett. Senator Whitehouse glanced up sharply, clearly considering whether to intervene. For 3 long seconds, Crockett remained perfectly still, her expression unreadable. The committee room fell silent. everyone waiting for what would surely be an explosive response to such a charged accusation from the veteran senator. Then, with remarkable composure, Crockett leaned toward her microphone. "Senator Sanders," she began, her voice measured and respectful, "I've long admired your passion for economic justice. That's why I know you understand the difference between confronting a broken system and attacking those working to reform it from within." She continued, "We share the same goals, ensuring corporations pay their fair share and American workers receive the dignity and compensation they deserve. Where we differ isn't in our values, but in our assessment of which tactics will actually achieve those goals." Rather than responding with defensiveness or counter-accusations, Crockett shifted to common ground. "Your decades of advocacy have changed the national conversation about economic justice, creating the political possibility for the very reforms we're discussing today. Perhaps instead of labeling each other, we could combine your moral clarity with pragmatic solutions that might actually help the Americans we both serve." This response, acknowledging Sanders' contributions while gently redirecting from personal accusation to substantive discussion, visibly shifted the energy in the room. Several committee members who had tensed for political fireworks now leaned forward with renewed interest. Sanders himself appeared momentarily taken aback by the gracious response to his pointed attack. "The question remains," he said, his tone notably less combative, "whether these incentives have sufficient enforcement mechanisms to prevent corporate abuse." "That's exactly the right question," Crockett responded, seizing the opportunity to move back to substance. "If you turn to page 47 of the committee materials, you'll find a detailed analysis of the enforcement provisions, including automatic triggers that don't require regulatory action to implement." As Sanders reviewed the reference materials, Crockett continued, "I believe these are the strongest enforcement mechanisms ever included in corporate tax legislation. But if you see specific weaknesses, I welcome your suggestions for strengthening them further." This invitation to collaboration rather than confrontation represented a pivotal moment in the hearing. Rather than the expected partisan standoff, viewers witnessed something far more substantive, a genuine exchange of ideas focused on improving policy outcomes. Senator Whitehouse, recognizing the productive turn in the conversation, extended Sanders' questioning period to allow for deeper discussion of the enforcement mechanisms. For the next several minutes, Sanders and Crockett engaged in a detailed examination of regulatory frameworks, penalty structures, and implementation timelines. By the end of this extended exchange, something remarkable had occurred. What began as an accusatory confrontation had transformed into a substantive policy discussion that identified actual improvements to the legislation. Sanders' concerns about enforcement had led Crockett to acknowledge potential strengthening amendments, while her detailed knowledge of implementation mechanics had addressed several of his fundamental objections. As Sanders' time expired, he made a statement that surprised many observers. "Mr. Chairman, I appreciate Representative Crockett's thorough responses. While I maintain reservations about aspects of this approach, I recognize the serious attempt to create accountability mechanisms that have been lacking in previous legislation." This acknowledgement, falling far short of endorsement but notably more constructive than his initial position, represented a significant shift from the confrontational tone that had characterized the beginning of the exchange. As the questioning moved to other committee members, the ripple effects of this exchange were immediately apparent. Subsequent questions focused more on substantive policy details and less on ideological positioning, creating what one observer later called the most productive committee hearing I've witnessed in years. As the hearing continued, the impact of the Crockett-Sanders exchange reverberated through the committee room and beyond. What had begun as a potentially explosive confrontation had transformed into something far more valuable, a model for how political differences could be addressed with both principle and grace. Senator Elizabeth Warren, next in the questioning order, acknowledged this shift directly. "Before I begin my questions," she said, "I want to commend both Senator Sanders and Representative Crockett for demonstrating how passionate advocacy and substantive policy expertise can complement rather than contradict each other. This acknowledgement, from a senator known for her own forceful questioning style, underscored the unusual nature of what had just transpired. Rather than the political point scoring that typically dominates such hearings, witnesses had just observed a genuine exchange of ideas that improved the legislation under consideration. Behind the scenes, the impact was immediate. Congressional reporters who had anticipated writing about political fireworks were instead furiously taking notes on the substantive policy discussion that had emerged. One veteran journalist was overheard telling a colleague, "I came for the conflict but stayed for the content. When was the last time that happened?" On social media, clips of the exchange were already circulating widely, with commentators from across the political spectrum noting the rarity of what they had witnessed. "This is what political discourse should look like," wrote one prominent conservative commentator, while a progressive activist noted, "Disagreement without demonization. Is this what hope feels like?" As the hearing concluded, Chairman Whitehouse took the unusual step of making a closing statement. Today's discussion, particularly the exchange between Senator Sanders and Representative Crockett, exemplifies the kind of substantive policy debate that should characterize our work. When we focus on outcomes rather than optics, we serve our constituents far better. In the hallway outside the hearing room, reporters surrounded Crockett, eager for comment on the confrontational moment that had unexpectedly transformed into collaboration. "Representative Crockett, were you offended by Senator Sanders' characterization?" asked a reporter from the Washington Post. "What matters isn't how questions are phrased, but whether they lead to substantive discussion," Crockett responded. Senator Sanders raised legitimate concerns about enforcement mechanisms, which is precisely the kind of scrutiny this legislation needs. The result was a more robust conversation about how we can actually hold corporations accountable. Another reporter pressed, "But he essentially called you complicit in criminal behavior. How did you maintain your composure?" Crockett smiled slightly. "In my previous career as an attorney, I learned that responding to the strongest version of someone's argument rather than their most provocative framing leads to better outcomes." Senator Sanders' core concern was about corporate accountability, a concern I share completely. Focusing on that common ground proved far more productive than taking offense. This response, elevating principle over personality and substance over spectacle, further distinguished Crockett's approach from typical Washington dynamics. Rather than seizing an opportunity for righteous indignation or political advantage, she had consistently redirected attention to the substantive policy issues at stake. As Crockett concluded her press availability, something unexpected occurred. Senator Sanders, who typically avoided post-hearing scrums with reporters, approached the group. The cameras captured what happened next. "Representative Crockett," Sanders said, extending his hand, "I appreciate your substantive responses to my questions. While we may approach these issues differently, your commitment to worker protections is evident." Crockett shook his hand. "Thank you, Senator. Your decades of advocacy have made these reforms possible. I look forward to continuing our discussion about strengthening the enforcement provisions." This brief but significant moment of mutual respect between two figures who had approached the same goals from very different angles captured the attention of political observers nationally. Within hours, the handshake was featured on news programs across networks, presented as a rare example of productive political disagreement. By evening, the political impact had become clear. Three senators who had previously expressed skepticism about the legislation released statements indicating their willingness to support it with strengthened enforcement provisions, exactly the modifications discussed during the Sanders-Crockett exchange. Senator John Tester, a moderate Democrat who had been on the fence, specifically cited the hearing in explaining his position. Today's discussion demonstrated that this legislation includes serious accountability mechanisms for corporations. The exchange between Senator Sanders and Representative Crockett highlighted both the strengths of the approach and areas where we can further strengthen enforcement. This shift in support represented a significant victory for the legislation, moving it considerably closer to passage. What had begun as a confrontational moment had ultimately advanced the very policy goals both Sanders and Crockett shared, despite their different approaches. Perhaps most significantly, Sanders himself issued an evening statement that surprised many observers. While I maintain that our approach to corporate accountability must be fundamentally transformed, today's hearing identified specific improvements to pending legislation that would create real consequences for corporations that exploit American workers. I will be introducing amendments to strengthen these provisions further. This statement, far from a full endorsement but notably constructive, represented a significant evolution from the confrontational tone that had characterized the beginning of the exchange. By responding to accusation with respect and substance rather than counterattack, Crockett had created space for collaboration that might otherwise have been closed completely. As one senior congressional staffer observed to Politico, what Crockett did today was magic. She took what could have been a viral moment of conflict and transformed it into actual legislative progress. That almost never happens here. The ripple effects of the Sanders-Crockett exchange extended far beyond that single committee hearing, influencing political discourse, media coverage, and even how Congress approached complex policy issues. By the following morning, major newspapers had featured the exchange prominently, with analyses focusing not on the brief confrontation, but on the substantive discussion that followed. The Washington Post ran a front-page analysis titled, "Beyond the Soundbite: How Crockett and Sanders Modeled Productive Political Disagreement." The New York Times editorial board noted that the exchange represented a all-too-rare moment when substance triumphed over spectacle in congressional proceedings. What particularly captured public attention was the contrast between expectation and reality. In an era when political disagreements typically escalated into personal attacks and hardened positions, viewers had witnessed something fundamentally different, a momentary confrontation that transformed into genuine dialogue and policy improvement. Media figures across the political spectrum commented on this unusual dynamic. On CNN's Anderson Cooper 360-degree, political analyst David Axelrod observed, "What made Crockett's response so effective wasn't just its graciousness, but how it redirected from personal conflict to substantive discussion. She didn't take the bait of personal offense, instead focusing on the policy goals she shared with Sanders." On Fox News, commentator Britt Hume noted, "Whatever your politics, there's a lesson here about effective communication. By acknowledging Sanders' core concerns while gently redirecting from accusation to substance, Crockett accomplished more than a dozen counterattacks could have." Social media analysis revealed something significant about public response. While initial clips of Sanders' accusatory question received typical partisan engagement, the full exchange, including Crockett's measured response and the substantive discussion that followed, garnered engagement from a much broader audience, including many users who typically avoided political content. "What we're seeing," noted digital media analyst Karen Silverman, "is hunger for political discourse that isn't just about conflict." The full exchange was shared across typical ideological divides, suggesting that Americans are eager for examples of constructive disagreement. Within Congress, the impact was both immediate and lasting. In the week following the hearing, the legislation moved through committee with several amendments directly inspired by the Sanders-Crockett exchange. The final bill included significantly strengthened enforcement provisions, including automatic triggers for tax benefit recapture if corporations reduced domestic employment after claiming incentives. When the amended bill came to the Senate floor, it passed with unusual bipartisan support, 67 votes, including that of Senator Sanders himself. In explaining his affirmative vote, Sanders made specific reference to the strengthened enforcement mechanisms, saying, "While this legislation falls short of the fundamental transformation our economy needs, these accountability provisions represent real progress for American workers." For Crockett personally, the aftermath brought increased national recognition and respect. Previously known primarily within policy circles, she became recognized as an effective communicator who could engage across ideological lines without compromising principles. Speaking requests flooded her office, particularly from organizations focused on civil dialogue and effective governance. When Harvard's Kennedy School of Government invited her to deliver a lecture on political communication, the event sold out within hours, requiring a venue change to accommodate interest. During this lecture, Crockett reflected on the principles that had guided her response to Sanders. "What I've found most effective isn't avoiding disagreement, but approaching it with both clarity and charity," she told the audience. "Clarity about your principles and positions, charity in how you interpret others' motives and concerns." She continued, "Senator Sanders and I share core values about economic justice and corporate accountability. Recognizing that common ground allowed us to move past a momentary confrontation to the substantive discussion that actually advanced those shared values. That's not compromise, it's effective advocacy." This approach, advocating forcefully for principles while engaging respectfully with different perspectives, became known informally as the Crockett method among congressional staff. Several House and Senate offices incorporated aspects of this approach into their communication training, particularly for committee hearings where substantive exchanges could meaningfully influence legislation. Senator Sanders, for his part, demonstrated his own political wisdom by embracing rather than resenting the productive turn in their exchange. In a 60 Minutes interview 3 months later, he addressed the incident directly. "What Representative Crockett did was remind me of something important," he acknowledged. "My decades of moral clarity about economic injustice created the political possibility for these reforms. But translating that moral clarity into effective policy requires the kind of technical expertise she brought to the discussion." He added with characteristic directness, "Righteous anger has its place, but so does pragmatic implementation. We need both to create real change." This mutual respect between figures with different approaches but shared goals represented something increasingly rare in American politics: the ability to disagree about methods while acknowledging common purposes. The most significant lasting impact emerged in how the exchange influenced political communication training and public expectations. Political science professors incorporated the video into their curriculum, using it to illustrate effective response to confrontation. The Harvard Negotiation Project developed a case study titled "Redirection Over Reaction: The Crockett Response," examining how acknowledging legitimate concerns while redirecting from personal attack to substance could transform confrontational dynamics. Congressional communication directors reported a noticeable shift in preparation approach for contentious hearings. "We now specifically prep members for transforming confrontational questions into substantive discussion," one senior Democratic staffer told Roll Call. "The goal isn't to win the exchange with a viral clapback, but to advance our policy objectives through substantive engagement." Media organizations also evolved their coverage approaches. Several major networks adjusted their political segments to include more complete exchanges rather than merely inflammatory moments, responding to audience feedback that viewers wanted to see the substance beyond the confrontation. 1 year later, the impact of that single exchange continued to reverberate through concrete policy outcomes. The corporate accountability provisions discussed during the Sanders-Crockett exchange had been implemented, resulting in measurable changes in corporate behavior. 3 major corporations that had previously planned offshoring reversed course, citing the tax benefit recapture provisions as a key factor in their decision. During a CNBC interview about these outcomes, Crockett was asked about the heated exchange that had helped shape the legislation. "What matters isn't the momentary tension," she responded, "but the substantive discussion that followed." Senator Sanders pushed for stronger accountability measures, which ultimately improved the legislation. That's how the process should work. This focus on outcomes over optics continued to distinguish Crockett's approach in an environment often dominated by performative politics. When later asked by a university student about her most effective political moment, she surprised many by not mentioning high-profile confrontations or viral clips. "The moments that matter most aren't when you deliver the perfect retort," she explained, "but when you transform a potential conflict into collaborative progress." "My exchange with Senator Sanders mattered not because of how I responded to his accusation, but because that response created space for the substantive discussion that actually strengthened corporate accountability provisions." She added, In politics, the goal isn't winning arguments. It's advancing the well-being of the people you serve. Sometimes that requires absorbing a momentary attack to keep focus on the substantive goals you share, even with those who approach those goals differently than you do. This perspective, prioritizing progress over personalities and substance over spectacle, offered a template for political engagement that transcended the typical partisan frameworks. As polarization continued to challenge American democracy, the Sanders-Crockett exchange remained a powerful example of how principled disagreement could lead to better outcomes than either capitulation or confrontation. Perhaps the most fitting testament came from an unexpected source. During a town hall meeting in his home state of Vermont, a constituent asked Sanders about the increasing polarization in American politics and whether constructive dialogue was still possible. "I've been fighting for economic justice for over 40 years, Sanders began in his characteristic style, "and I'll never apologize for the moral clarity of that fight." Then, with a slight smile, he continued, "But I was reminded recently by a colleague in the House that moral clarity is most effective when paired with substantive engagement. Representative Crockett showed that you can be both principled and pragmatic, passionate about justice while practical about implementation. We need more of that approach, not less, if we're going to create the changes American workers desperately need." This acknowledgement, from one of America's most uncompromising political voices, perhaps best captured the lasting legacy of their exchange. In demonstrating how graceful engagement could be more effective than righteous reaction, Crockett had offered a template for political communication that advanced shared values more effectively than the confrontational alternatives that typically dominate our discourse. If you found this analysis valuable, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support enables us to continue bringing you in-depth examinations of the pivotal moments that shape our political landscape beyond the soundbites and sensationalism.